I'm Jean Nolte, editor at Fons & Porter.
And I'm Colleen Tauke. I'm the sewing specialist at Fons & Porter. In this tutorial, we're going to show you how to put together two quilts. And the name is Dolly and Me.
For the pattern for these quilts, go to fonsandporter.com/quiltingquickly. Well, these are fun little quilts. There's one that's toddler size and one that's the size for a doll. And they're made exactly the same way, just using different size pieces.
Right. We start with 5-inch squares for the toddler quilt and 2.5-inch squares for the dolly quilt.
And this is probably a really good first project for somebody. This is about as easy as they get. The first thing you're going to do is take your squares, and we'll start with the toddler size quilt. So you have 5-inch squares, and you divide them into groups, 9 groups of 4 and 3 groups of 2.
The reason why we're going to divide it up before we start sewing is that we don't want to get to the end and have 2 yellow prints or 3 orange prints all in one 4 patch. So it makes it a little scrappier if we kind of plan just a little bit ahead.
Right. So the first thing you're going to do is chain piece and join everything into 2 patches. Once you've pressed the seams to one side, you're going to set 3 of those aside.
Right. They're going to be spacers. So
the rest of them you're going to join into pairs, and you can see here where we've joined them. We opposed the seams, so one points to the left and one points to the right, and it makes you have a really nice corner there.
Nice flat intersection. Remember as you go along to press. Pressing is one of those things we tend to want to avoid because it takes us away from our sewing machine, but the end product is so much nicer and crisper and easier to work with if you press as you go. So remember that. So
I'm going to just start. So once you've made your 2 patches and your 4 patches, you're going to join them into rows with spacer strips in between them, and then you have, for in between the rows, you'll have longer strips, so you'll have another row here, and then the wider strips that you've cut will be your outer border.
All the way around, as you can see in the quilt behind us.
Right. Now, when you want to make the dolly quilt, it's the exact same process.
Just a little smaller.
You'll have smaller 2 patches and smaller 4 patches.
And the sashing and the border are in proportion to the rest of the quilt, as you can see.
Smaller. Now, the other thing that this quilt has is bias binding. And it's not necessary because it's a straight quilt.
Correct.
But you'll look here. This is binding that was cut straight. And if you use this, when you put it on your quilt, the binding will have stripes.
Just little tiny stripes.
Straight.
Right.
But if you cut bias binding, you'll get the diagonal look like we have on the quilts behind us. So
that candy stripe just sets off the quilt. It just makes it say fun, and it jumps out at you when you look at the quilt. And same with the little dolly quilt. It's a great way to have practice making bias binding and working with it on a small quilt. Right. So we're going to show you how to cut it.
So to cut it, you need to find the 45-degree line on your ruler. And I have marked it with a piece of tape on the back just to make it easier when I get ready to cut that.
That's a really good tip, because a lot of times we'll say, oh, I know there's diagonals on my ruler, I can use them. And then when you get to go and cutting, you're like flipping the ruler around and around, and that tape will just let your eye fall right at the 45-degree line each time.
Right. So what I've done here is lined up that line right along the bottom of my piece of fabric that I'm cutting my binding from.
And we have straightened that edge, so it's a nice, clean, straight piece.
And I'm just going to cut a strip. So there. And now you cut this binding the same way you would cut anything else. We use 2 1/4 inches. So I put the 2 1/4 inch line on that cut edge.
And 2 1/4.
There we go. And then I'm going to just cut a strip.
Now the strip that we're cutting on here is smaller to accommodate the size of our studio. So you would be cutting continuous strips like that across and then joining those together.
But now you can see that when you fold this binding, you're going to have those diagonal stripes rather than straight stripes. And it just makes a little fancier binding.
Candy stripe
binding.
Not
all that hard. Exactly. This is also a technique you would use if you had curved edges on your quilt. You would need the bias binding to get around those curves.
It gives you a flexibility with the bias edges. It stretches and gives a little bit. And this is a great way to practice the technique of making and creating bias binding. Thanks for joining us today.
For more videos like this, go to our website.